Welcome to Crucial Conversations, a series of conversations with various guests to engage in difficult subjects. This series is coming to you from Central Christian Church in downtown Indianapolis. This month's series is on anti-racism. Our focus is not on interpersonal violence of racism, but systemic racism that is rooted in our institutions, including the church. Please join us each week on Thursdays when we release new episodes. Welcome to the inaugural podcast / vlog of Central Christian Church's Crucial Conversations here in our parlor in Indianapolis. I'm Pastor Luis.
I am Pastor Linda.
And I am Student Pastor Grace.
We look forward to this opportunity to engage each other in conversations on a myriad of topics, things that are deeply passionate for us as pastors, but also for us as leaders within Central Christian Church. We are using the vlog / podcast as a way of connecting with people, not only in our sanctuary and in our community, but outside of our community. During the pandemic, we have tried to find different ways to connect with one another, and we think that this will be a good opportunity to kind of peek behind the curtain of what we do as pastors and leaders in the church as we're thinking about different topics. You know, our staff here, we're going to be doing a series of different topics that will focus on things that we are passionate about. And so today, we're going to be starting on our first conversation that is going to be on anti-racism. Now, many people who listen go, it's kind of oxymoronical that a church will be working on anti-racism, right? I mean, you guys are Christians, you're followers of Christ. How can you be racist, or how can you be in a racist institution? However, working in churches, it's an important thing to have the mirror looking back at you so you can self-reflect. And so we as a congregation have been on a journey for quite some time, but specifically this past year, we started a process, a journey that will help us reflect to address the issues of anti-racism. Now, the challenge with that is when people hear the word anti-racism or racism, they think of kind of the interpersonal connections that you have with people. If we were to do this podcast, let's say last summer, many people would think we were just jumping on the cultural bandwagon of just addressing the issue at hand of systemic police brutality against the Black community. However, anti-racism is much bigger than that. And so what we're trying to address is how do we become an anti-racist institution? And there's a lot of conversations that are going around that topic. And our hope is in these next kind of conversations that we have with one another and the subsequent conversations we'll have with some guests, our hope is that each of you who are listening and watching will get to see that the topic of anti-racism and dealing with systemic racism isn't just a pop conversation. It's something that's been going on and people have been working at for years, not only in the institutional church and organizations, but in many different facets of our life. And so we're just excited to have that opportunity and kind of just kickstart that conversation with us. And today, this is just kind of a look at whenever we are talking about topics such as this as a pastoral staff, what are the things that drives us and how do we talk about these things together? I am excited for this conversation, and I guess where we can start off is the church we serve is a church in downtown Indianapolis, and if Pastor Linda, you'd be more than happy to share with us kind of a brief overview about what Central has been working on and doing on with anti-racism since you've been here.
Sure. Yeah, and I may even go a little bit further back in history than that, just to set a context. for this conversation. Central Christian Church in Indianapolis is an old institution. It was founded in 1833 here in downtown Indianapolis, and so it was certainly founded by white people. It has been, I think it was exclusively composed of white members through many, many, many decades, 100 years, more than 100 years. But I think that in the last probably 40 to 50 years, a lot of things, I won't go into the history, but there's a lot of change in a downtown area, and the congregation sort of has slowly changed as well, and has had some members and friends, participants who are people of color for many decades, but it has remained a predominantly white congregation and led by predominantly white people, but with some folks who are people of color. But at the same time, I think part of Central's DNA is to be connected to the world around us, and so a commitment to this neighborhood, this downtown area, has been part of our identity. And then just looking beyond, and I think Central has struggled, like many, many churches have struggled, to make an impact. So for a long time we've had a food pantry and a free clothing program and a thrift shop, and those have made an impact on individuals' lives, people who had basic needs, who were needing those basic stuff of life. But at the same time, we were trying to figure out how to make an impact on the system that makes people poor and keeps people poor. And so wrestling with that over the last several years, one of the ways that we've done that is to try to dive a little bit deeper into systemic racism and our part in it. So we've had some programming over the years. The last 5 to 10 years, I know we did a book study at one point of the book called Waking Up White. We have shared stories of our members and friends. We happen to have people in our congregation who were involved for instance, in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So we have someone, a dear elder member who just died a year ago, Leon Riley, who participated in the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, and another older member, Don McCord, who participated in Freedom Summer in Mississippi, helping accompanying voter registration efforts. I believe that was 1963. So we have people with other kinds of experiences. Sandra Gourdet grew up in Alabama in the 1960s and 70s, was one of the first people to integrate an all-white school in Birmingham. So rich resources that have helped to educate us. But I think at some point we realized that we also need to do more than be open. We need to do more than not be racist. Mm-hmm. We need to see how we can become actively anti-racist, and that racism as a system is embedded in all of our institutions, and the church is no exception to that. So whether we're conscious, that largely it's unconscious, because we don't want to be racist. Mm-hmm. We try not to be racist, but unconsciously and in our systems, there are ways that we perpetuate the racism that we receive, that we inherit. And so it's a challenging journey to figure out how to make that shift to being actively anti-racist. Mm-hmm. So, and I think as you are aware, because you're very much a part of the process, we have now established a team within the congregation. We are working with an organization called Crossroads, Antiracism Organizing and Training, and they led us in a workshop in the month of March of 2020, right before the lockdown, in which about 80 people from our congregation participated, and a team that's been established kind of out of that process is now, we're working to try to figure out how we as a congregation can move forward in this.
So, Grace, you are the newest one of us in the bunch here, but why is anti-racism a topic that interests you?
Well, I think for me, I came to Central as a student pastor. I'm a second-year seminary student. And before seminary, I got my master's in social work with a concentration in community organizing, and worked as an organizer for a couple of years before I came to Indianapolis and went to seminary. And so when I think about anti-racism, I am looking at it from that lens. And so for me, there are a lot of reasons why I am passionate about the topic, but particularly in the church, growing up in an all-white congregation, there was so much embedded racism in my in that institution that I wasn't aware of really until I went to college, went to grad school, and started learning more and more about the realities of particularly systemic racism. Like, you hear about when you're a little kid. I learned a very colorblind way of looking at the world, like God loves everyone equally, which is of course true, but I didn't learn about how the world does not love everyone equally. And so I think for me,
while singing the song,
exactly.
Red, yellow, black, right?
Exactly.
Naming all the colors. Right?
Yes, all the colors. And again, of course, God loves everyone equally. That remains true. But again, you don't learn anything about how the world treats people differently because of racist systems, and how me being nice to everyone doesn't really change that. So when I think though about now being part of more mainline congregation, one of the reasons why I think it's really important for us to be having these conversations is that as Linda was saying, our institutions are not immune from racism, and I think that Shonda Jha puts this better than I could in terms of why it's important to be looking at our racist past. She says, read our history with openness to what this past means in terms of why we function as a church the way we do today, and whether we are satisfied with that. So are we satisfied now with the remnants of our disciples' history? So looking back at our founding, we're talking about wanting to be this, now we talk about a movement for wholeness in a fractured world. And when we were founded as the Stone Campbell movement, they were back then talking about unity, kind of the same way our culture is talking about unity now. How do we come together? And they really wanted to unite around some basic theological principles. But one of the things that I find interesting about that is the founders of our movement didn't want to take a stance on slavery because they thought it would disrupt a movement for unity. And that is kind of mind-blowing to me, because it's so you don't think slavery might be a barrier to unity too, our bodily and our spiritual unity. Yeah. Or with Alexander Campbell. So he was a man who was enslaved, and the Kentucky Mission Society, part of that movement, paid for his freedom because of what he could give to them. He was a gifted preacher. And he had to work 3 more years, Alexander Campbell did, to raise the money to purchase his wife out of slavery. And then thinking, moving forward a little bit, thinking about the paternalism, after slavery is abolished, you have white disciples sponsoring education efforts for Black Americans, but they really only want to fund trade schools or this certain kind of education. So then, fast forwarding even more, you have the Black Manifesto of the 60s demanding of not just the disciples, but all of the mainline white churches $500 million in reparations. And you can see, looking back at our history, why that's not an unreasonable request. we have been an active participant in the economic suppression of not just Black people and other people of color in the country, but specifically within our own church. And so the disciples' response to that was to give 20%, to work toward giving 20% of positions within the denomination to people of color. And that response doesn't really look at the history. That response is saying, well, indicates feeling bad about it, but it's like, we want you to come into the system we've already built. So I think that looking at our past, for me as an organizer, it's like, okay, you have to look at that and really face it. And once you do that, okay, become a movement for wholeness in a fractured world. How do those fractures, we can't just pretend those fractures aren't there and try and find an easier or different way to move beyond them. I think that we have to be much more intentional about looking at that history and whether or not we're satisfied with what we've done. Yeah.
So it sounds like, for you, it has been your education in social work and your education while you're in seminary that has intrigued you about the systemic issues that have caused so much, right?
Yeah.
Pain in our country. Linda, is there anything that has shaped why anti-racism is something that speaks to you and something you want to use your voice for?
Yeah, sure. And I think I'd start with kind of my own formation. Growing up, not only growing up, but still today, I have a sister who is a person of color, just a year younger than I am. And so in some ways, I got the beginning of an education very young, living with her, although I realize how blind I was in many ways to her experience. But we were, in our family, my parents, the values of my parents were very open. They included sort of challenging racism as part of their approach to life. And then I know that spending time outside the US and in other cultures has been really formative for me, seeing how it's not just certainly not just a US issue. Mm-hmm. There is, I experienced, I observed and witnessed racism in other contexts in Mexico and Central America. And then also, learned about sort of the world dynamics of how racism plays out country against country. It's always been a concern for me, and I just think that historically we're in this moment, probably since 2008, when the US elected a Black president, and we saw the backlash, or white lash as it's sometimes called, to that, the rise of hate groups and hate speech and all kinds of oppression, and then just the events that have occurred since then. 2008, sort of a reaction. 8 years later, electing a very different kind of president that sort of has fed some of the hate, in my opinion. And so it just, I think, brings us to this moment where it is a ripe time. It's never not been a good time to do it, but it's extremely ripe right now. And I think as a pastor and as pastors of a congregation, our call is to listen to what we are, what God is calling us to do in this moment. Mm-hmm. And there are many things, but among them for us, as we've discerned it as leaders and as a congregation as a whole, anti-racism is a primary call for us to try to work for that vision of wholeness in the world. So how about yourself?
Well, both Linda and Grace, both of you grew up in Indiana. Am I correct?
Correct.
Right. I grew up in Indiana, as you both know. I'm from New York City, born and raised, and I grew up in a very multicultural community, a very diverse community, not just socioeconomically, but also just culturally. And yet, no matter that I was in a school with kids of different cultural backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, as far as we talk about the Hispanic spectrum of Latinos within the United States, and then color and all that, yet racism still existed, right? I think one of the biggest things that I learned growing up was kind of the misnomer that racism was only in certain parts of the United States, right? It's not in big cities. It's definitely not in the north, right? Maybe it's because how they taught us about the end of the Civil War and all the movies that have come out for that. But racism still existed, and I had a personal experience in my life that really shaped me because the only person who defended me at that time when someone was accusing me of something was a person of color who did not know me, who knew nothing about me, and there was just like, and I just, that has always stood out to me in my mind. I've always been around people, my friends are people who are from different backgrounds. In college, my roommates were Italian, white, Black, Korean, and those are the peoples that I connected with and stay connected to today. And yet we still talk to each other in very, in many ways in very prejudiced undertones, right? Because as much as you want to believe it, each of us are socialized differently and we carry some prejudices of each other there. But it wasn't until I came to seminary once again and I was introduced to different theological writings, and then one of my professors, Ron Somerville, who was part of the anti-racism team at CTS, was like, "Hey, Luis," he's a Black man from Philadelphia. I'm from New York. He thought, hey, maybe some East Coast love will work here. Let me pull you into this. And then I didn't know what to expect when I heard the word, oh, you're going to be a part of an anti-racism team. And we started talking. And it was my first introduction to the topic in a systemic way. And since then, it is something that has stood out to me, something that I would like to be intentional with and work at. In every job that I've been a part of, whether it's been in chaplaincy or church, I've been vocal about trying to represent those voices because sometimes white churches, white communities get too comfortable and believe that, we live in a post-racial world. You mentioned, Barack Obama's election in 2008, and well, we elected a Black president. That means we're not a racist country. But systemically, we don't see that as a reality. And the other thing that I'm also cautious, right? That being the, male person of color on staff in a predominantly white church, what does it feel and look like you being a voice talking about anti-racism and being an anti-racist church? So I know that I love to push the conversation, but I also know what it feels like when you're pushing the conversation and others may not be ready for that. So this is why the topic also intrigues me too. I'm a very confrontational person, just in case you didn't know that. So I don't mind these conversations and I enjoy them. But that's why, when we talked about, hey, what are the conversations we're gonna have, these crucial conversations, what are some topics? Because we've been on this journey with the church for some time, I felt like this was the best one.
And I think it's interesting that you say that you're confrontational. So I'm a millennial and I get a lot of my information from Twitter. So I read a Twitter thread recently. I didn't want to lie and say it was an article because it wasn't. But it was from a guy who said that he's learning that white people don't really have this. They don't have practice in having real talk.
Yeah.
It's we talk around things, but when we get to the thing we really need to talk about, it's like, oh, that's for next time. We're gonna kick that can a little bit further down the road. We don't have practice in really any avenue of our lives for the most part. This is certainly true for me. I shouldn't, speak for my husband is a very confrontational person and he's white, but as culturally, white people do not want to talk about the hard stuff because we know it'll be really hard. So being able to hopefully push ourselves in these conversations to talk about the real stuff will be good.
And I think that's a good way to kind of also finish off and segue into the expectations, right? Like the expectations of these conversations isn't that when people hear us talking about it, they're like, oh, you know what? That's right. Everything is racist. We gotta change. We know that it is. We're hoping that we're pushing people towards thinking about this more deeply, not just on the surface level, right? We know that this is a long journey, and it's been a long journey. And we're just a small part of the work that's being done, but the conversations do need to be had.
And maybe we would add, the idea of a conversation is two-way, right? So,
Yeah.
and not just us here today, but hopefully with people who are watching or listening. I think about, these are the kinds of conversations we would have in our space if we were together right now, which we're not because of the pandemic. They're also the kind of conversations that we want to have with people that we haven't yet met. So I hope over time we'll figure out how to have some further the conversation with those who are listening, whether that's through email or some kind of place where people can post.
Yeah,
That'd be great.
Well, this has been a really great conversation, a great place to start. I look forward for us to talk more about this. And I look forward to the conversations that we're going to be having with leaders from the Black Lives Matter movement, from the General President and Minister of the Disciples of Christ Church, and with Crossroads Antiracism and Organizational Group. So we have some great guests that are going to be with us and going to talk with us and walk alongside us during these conversations. And we look forward to hearing from you all and joining us on this journey. So take care.